York ain't New York anymore. How I miss those old pals of mine.
It was once the stuff of unattainable dreams, kept out of reach by lynch mobs, police dogs, and fire hoses. But in 2008, Barack Obama fulfilled the promise of the words, "All men are created equal." We'll take a look back at the man who literally changed the face of the Oval Office just in time for President's Day and Black History Month.
I, Barack Hussein Obama, do solemnly swear.
Hello, history lovers, and welcome. I'm your host, Dean Carianis, and this is the History Author Show on iHeartRadio, and a special tip of the cap to everybody watching today's time travel adventure via our YouTube and Rumble channels. You can find me at historyauthor.com, or you can see me across social media platforms. You can also read my columns in the Washington Times to get my analysis of current events through the lens of history. Speaking of current events, this may be my most current historical book ever, and boy am I happy to bring it to you. In this episode, our time machine travels back to the recent past, where we'll examine the legacy of our two-term 44th Commander-in-Chief with an eye on how his legacy opened doors for his successor to turn the whole world of politics upside down. Our guide on this journey is Professor Claude A. Clegg III. He brings us The Black President, Hope and Fury in the Age of Obama. He is the Lyle V. Jones Distinguished Professor at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And he has a joint appointment in the Department of African, African American, and Diaspora Studies and the Department of History. You can find him at claudeclegg.com and at Claude Clegg on Twitter. That's Clegg spelled C-L-E-G-G. Okay, now that we've arrived back at election night of 2008, let's join Professor Clegg as he introduces us to the Black President. And here we are with Professor Claude A. Clegg III. He's joining us to chat about the Black President, Hope and Fury in the Age of Obama. Thank you so much for making the time to chat with the History Author Show, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Well, I appreciated that you reached out to me via Twitter, and we got to talking about the view of history that we have of people that are contemporary and that aren't in the rearview mirror. Certainly here with the Obama presidency, the full story can't be written of the man's life. So I wondered, it's great for me to be able to read such a book, but for you, that's kind of a challenge and definitely a little bit of a thankless job, because anything could happen at any moment that maybe upends some of the narrative that you've put together here, some of the things you've looked back at. There could be a treasure trove of new emails. This is not as if it's somebody, we even find that about presidents from long ago. So why did you take on that challenge of writing about somebody that's contemporary, that's certainly in living memory, knowing that the full story couldn't be told yet to completion?
Dean, that's a wonderful question, and it's one of those questions that keep historians up at night. That is, what is the next generation of folks going to say about this subject? And of course, every generation of historians write their own histories. That's the reason we're still getting Lincoln biographies. He's the most written about person that I can think of in the history of the world. But that's exactly the thinking. That is, some new source might show up, or new ways of thinking about old sources. So in the case of this particular book, I can remember back in 2008 when I and millions of others were just riveted by the Democratic presidential primaries, where you have two fairly even matched U.S. senators, Barack Obama and Hillary Rodham Clinton, who are running for the Democratic nomination, and either one of them winning it would have been historic. So I imagine everyone else who was watching and paying attention knew that I was looking at something historic happening. And of course, for us historians, that's, we always are seeing things that turn out to be historic, but at the same time, we usually don't, the average one of us, there's those historians who do write recent history, as I guess I'm one now, but we usually are most comfortable looking at things in the rearview mirror and not through the windshield, the front glass. That is, we look at history, we look at topics after some dust has settled, and we have some hindsight, and we have some perspective, we have the long view, and so forth. So again, looking at the Obama presidency or looking at him win the presidency in 2008, I knew something historic had happened and I wanted to write that history. And of course, the challenge is exactly what you put your finger on. How do you think historically about something that's not quite history, so to speak? That is something that's you're watching unfold and you're taking notes and you're trying to figure out what is the through line for what you're looking at. What are going to be the legacies? What are people going to be thinking about in 10, 15, 50 years from now? So that was the challenge of writing about Obama in the moment or shortly after the moment. That is trying to anticipate what the major themes, major legacies, major takeaways would be years from now. Of course, it gives you the impulse of, well, since I don't know that, I'm going to collect everything. I'm going to collect all the sources I can find. I'm going to build as big an archive as I can build so that I don't miss anything. Of course, it's kind of a fallacy that you can do all of the research and you can tell all of the story. The story, as you're saying, is going to unfold and other historians are going to come forward, and then his personal papers at some point in the future, his presidential papers will be released and so forth, and that will fill things out. But I found that in writing about him and publishing a book 4 years after he left the presidential mansion and left the White House, there was plenty of sources, and I had built an archive that included government records, of course, the news cycle stuff, and it's more than enough of that sort of thing just to do a book just on the news cycle. I talked to people, there were interviews, of course, there were books by other scholars who came out. Obama wrote his own books, people around him wrote their own books. So I found no lack of sources in regard to putting together a history of his presidency, which has a big biographical component to it. But of course, that was the challenge of the piece, to wearing a historian's hat to watch something unfold and try to historicize it in a way that brings some value in regard to trying to understand the legacy of what you just saw. I think the bigger value was that when people read this, hopefully read this book in 50 or 100 years ago, a historian writing about this or thinking about this in the moment, I think has a kind of value. Political scientists, sociologists, ethnographers do it all the time. That's, they write about and think about and analyze things as they're happening. A political scientist looks at the elections that just happened and tries to understand the demographic shape and texture of who voted how and what states did what and so forth. It's not that scholars don't do this sort of thing. It's just historians don't do a lot of it. But that was the real, I don't know if that was the fun of it, but that was a challenge that I think has some value. A historian in the moment of something or shortly after the moment of something happening, trying to figure out what the legacy is, what the through line is, and to put something in historical perspective.
Yeah, the thing about The Black President is you could have written it 50 years from now, it'd be a different book. And it is important to get that down, because we do think, well, why write about something we're living through? Because especially now we have video, everyone has their phone is kind of an historian on their phones now, right? There's video, there's audio, that we lived through it. So I think that's important to have your book here, because people will look back in 50 years, as they do with many of the biographies that I have on my shelf, and say, oh, this is what they were thinking about him right after this guy left the White House. This is what they thought about him 20 years later when he enjoyed a little bit of a renaissance or something new came out. And for me, I've read a biography on each of our presidents, and I always try to find something that's a positive legacy. And that's even for guys like James K. Polk or John Tyler or Andrew Johnson, who really challenge you to find something decent about them. Maybe it's just their relationship with their wife. Unlike somebody who comes into the White House that's freshly elected, that has, okay, what's my legacy going to be? You have somebody who, the minute he takes his hand off that Lincoln Bible and is sworn in, he has his place in history set. It almost wouldn't matter. They could never take that away from him after he achieves that. His legacy is cemented. That's the first line in the bio, in the biography, in the obituary. That's it. He has it. So I wonder how The Black President, when you write this book, how does that both free and constrain him in office? Because there is still that hard job of governing. There will be another campaign in 4 years when he runs for re-election. So how do you hope people will see that, put that first line aside and say, oh, by the way, he was not just a symbol, he was not just a token in the White House, but he had to do some hard work of governing, and now I'm going to tell you the story in my book.
Yeah, well, that is the story of the book. I think that as you were saying, the obituary, all of the history books that come after, first African American president. And for a lot of people, some voters, especially Black voters, that was it. If whatever happened after that election, okay, whatever. But that election was the legacy. I started the book with a conversation with my dad, was in his 70s at the time, who had never voted before, although he was in his 70s, and he was inspired to go vote for this guy. He didn't think it was possible for an African-American man or woman to get elected to this highest office in the land. And it happens. And for him, and I think millions of other people, he could go to his grave after that. My dad, who was in his 70s, he's since passed, and know that this was possible in this country. And my dad would have, of course, 70 years at the time of long view of American history, Civil Rights Movement, Great Depression, World War II, and so forth. But the through line for the presidency for him was that this happened in my lifetime, that a Black guy, given the history of this country, it was possible in America, maybe only in America, for this guy from a minority group with this biography, with this family, gets elected. So
the name, as he often said, right? He often said the funny name, right? So
yeah, with this funny name, as the ball said, skinny guy with the funny name from Hawaii, with this mixed race background gets elected. So it says something very powerful about the country, especially in that particular moment. But of course, after that, you have to govern, you have to deliver, especially if you're interested in re-election, and the vast majority of American presidents are interested in re-election. So I think we all know in hindsight that the expectations of his presidency, maybe this is for most presidencies, were off the charts and way too high. He came into office when the economy was in free fall. We were losing hundreds of thousands of jobs per month in late 2008, early 2009. We were in two wars, which were going sideways, not going too well. And, people were losing their homes and just a bad time. So he comes in office on the mantra of hope and change. And I think that, and then of course, it's this historic presidency and so forth, this guy getting elected. So the expectations are through the roof for him. And I think being the first African-American president, he has the burden, and you allude to this in your question, the burden of representation. One of his daughters, his oldest daughter, Leah, right as he gets elected president, right as I think they're going to the inauguration in January 2009, she tells him, first African-American president, you better be good. And I think that she sort of captures sort of the burden of representation. That is, he has to do a credible job. He has to be a serious, competent. There are going to be missteps and mistakes and so forth, but he can't flame out in the middle of this presidency, or he may be the last African-American president. Of course, it's unfair, that is, to judge 40 million people by the performance of one person who just happens to share the same pigmentation. But at the same time, it's the nature of how I think American race relations, how we think about race, especially how we think about the first person to do something. That first person is a stand-in for the whole group. If Hillary Clinton had won the White House in 2008 or 2016, she, rightly or wrongly, is a reflection on all women. And people would have judged her presidency as, this first president, as female president, as speaking to the capacities of women generally in regard to their ability to be commanders in chief or chief executives. So I think there's less freedom in this for Obama than there is obligation and the burden of representation. I don't think he's freed until really he stepped down in January of 2017. I think the whole time it's a performance, it's a tight wire act. He's trying not to fall into all the stereotypes about African Americans. He at no time is wearing the angry Black man look. He knows that's not a good look for a president, for a Black president. And Michelle Obama is the first African-American first lady, knows that's not a good look for her as well. So it's a performance the whole time. And I think it's a tough performance in a lot of instances.
He certainly had that feeling. You could tell when he walked in a room. He talks about when he had his first job at a big corporation, and he says, I felt like I was behind enemy lines. and how he had to perform a certain way, and how he knew what people's expectations were, and all across the board. And that's something that you cover here in The Black President, where it's what Alice Roosevelt Longworth, who was Theodore Roosevelt's daughter, eldest child, she said about her brother Ted. Poor Ted, if he gets compared to his father everywhere. If he walks across the street, you have three guys that say, well, his father would have done it better. And if he walks across perfectly, they say, he did it just as old Teddy would have done it. So the guy can't win, right? You either do it perfectly and satisfy everybody, or you do it like, oh, wow, he's, I kind of recoil at even saying it, but people will say, well, wow, he's just as good as a white president. Well, gee, yeah. And a lot of people don't even realize it, who maybe think that they're very aware and voted for him, but they have that little bit of doubt. And a little bit like people in certain endeavors, they say, well, he's the first Black person to coach a Super Bowl, let's say, and people doubt that. So he has that all on him, as you said, walking that narrow path. And then on top of that, everybody's saying, okay, now finish the work of Lincoln and Martin Luther King Jr. So that's like, oh, gee, no pressure at all here, right?
Exactly. And again, it's an impossible position to be in. And for all the reasons that you just said, Dean, there are all these other standards that you're going to be placed against the 43 other white guys who were before you. So they're going to be the standard. And then there's going to be the standard of, ironically, being the first African-American president. There are those who I think thought that was by itself magical and special and so forth, and he was going to be able to split oceans and walk on water and so forth, because that was so new and different, and because of the situation the country was in. So this guy's going to come in with this transformational vision and all this hope and change and big majorities in the Congress and so forth, but again, the expectations were just through the roof. They could not be satisfied by anyone. But I think you're exactly right that there would always be that measuring stick that is, how is this guy going to do it different, better, the same as the 43 guys before him, who are not going to be judged quite the same way, because they were all white guys, and that the racial element was not there for judging them. I think the assumption was that they were each their own individual person, and you don't judge Reagan by Nixon's failures. You don't judge Abraham Lincoln by George Washington and so forth. That they were all their unique persons, and certainly you're not going to judge the talents, the failings, the shortcomings of all white people based on what a white president does. However, in the minds of, I think, a lot of people, you may judge the group, African Americans, as a group based on what this particular African American does in the White House. And I think that again, it's the burden of being in a minority group, in whether it's a religious minority, ethnic minority, racial minority, gender minority. It's the burden of being in such a group that's been marginalized, and then one sort of bubbles to the top and it has access to power. The group will be judged by the performance of this one. That is, if this one is able to slip into the door of power and go down the corridors of power, the group, for the most part, left out of those corridors of power, are going to probably be really, really loyal and want to see what happens to that one that slips through. And that one that slips through is going to be under a microscope more intense than they ever experienced it. So I think that's what's going on with Obama. He's very, I think, conscious of it. And he I think for the most part handles that the intensity of that scrutiny pretty well, to the point that his whole goal was to make this look normal, to have a first Black family for 8 years, and for us to look at him with the same metrics and judge him by the same criteria as we would any other president. So that was the whole thing to make this look normal. But we all know it was not normal to have a Black president, a Black first family in the White House for that many years. But I think his whole hope was that I'm in a lineage of 43 other people, and judge me by the standards you judge these other heads of state. Don't judge me by the standard you judge a civil rights leader like King. Don't judge me by Jesse Jackson, this guy who ran for the presidency before me, don't judge me by these standards that you're not going to judge everyone else by, who sat in this office. Judge me by the standards of these 43 predecessors, which would be the normal thing to do.
It reminds you of Margaret Thatcher when they asked her at one point, what does it feel like to be a female prime minister? And she said, I don't know. I never experienced the alternative. So you go in, you have the job. Okay, you're president. Even though that's the title of your book, the Black President, and that's the way people will look at you. And sometimes they'll say the Republican president or Democratic president. And of course, you're just the president. And for a long time, it was just the president. And I really noticed that here, reading your book, The Black President. And you mentioned America there and how maybe this could only happen in America. And that brought me to my next question, because I remember reading at the time that Barack Obama's father back in Kenya, even somebody of his tribe in Kenya wouldn't have been considered for the presidency, and that they would have been kept out. And I thought that's fascinating to me, or noteworthy anyway, because we tend to look at a group and say, oh, okay, everybody's the same. They're monolithic, as you were just saying. I know with Greek people, there's 2,000 islands. They're very regional. There are people, for instance, with my last name that were not welcomed in Greece when they came. They considered them Turks as refugees from the genocide, and they can't even agree on one day to commemorate the Greek genocide at the hands of the Turks. Everyone has their own little one. So there's division within these groups, and yet I guess because we're busy or what have you, some people just because they're ignorant, they lump everybody together. So my question here about the Black president is, you talk about his base being complex, layered, and fractured. You talked about the hope that people have when he comes in on hope. That slogan is a great political slogan because it means whatever the person hearing it wants to mean. How were those divisions manifest in the Black community, where people on the outside would have assumed, okay, everybody must support him right to the last minute?
Right, yes. So that was one of the more fascinating things about the research and doing the book. And that is, it's as much a commentary on America as it is on this guy who's sitting in the Oval Office for those 8 years. It's as much a commentary about the Black community, all the various divisions and interests and groupings and porousness of the Black community. Even the notion of a Black community is a problematic notion, because it's there's so many layers of class and gender division and region and so forth. So even thinking about a Black community or African American community in any sort of monolithic, singular, unitary way is problematic. So I dug into this notion of a Black community, Black America, and so forth. And wow, on the one hand, the way that African Americans vote would suggest, okay, these folks are more or less on the same page. You know, whoever the Democratic nominee for the president is going to get 85, 90% of the Black vote. Okay. Peel that back though, and all of these discussions and all of this discourse and all this pushback and so forth is there. Part of I think the surprises that I saw in the book was that certain constituencies, certain segments of quote unquote Black America had these bruising debates about what Obama should be doing and what he shouldn't be doing. One facet of that debate is the notion that there should have been more targeted policies coming out of his administration that were designed to address the plight of those at the bottom of this recession, which we later called the Great Recession. So African Americans at the worst of it are suffering almost a 17% unemployment rate, which is really depression level unemployment, not just recessionary unemployment. So there were those in academia, in the clergy, the Congressional Black Caucus, and the Congress who said, who were pushing Obama, hey, look, it's fine and well, this hope and change and, these universalist policies that are supposed to lift the tide for all boats and so forth. But you have a constituency, President Obama, that went out and voted for you. 96% of their votes went for you in 2008 and 93% in 2012. And you're not tailoring policies to address, across the board, mass incarceration, unemployment, home foreclosures, urban decay, education issues. Where are the policies? If politics is a transactional sport, quid pro quo, we vote for you, you do something for us. Where's the you do something for us part of it? Academicians, Black academicians, I think the debates over these sorts of political approaches and strategies is probably the most serious debate and also the most bitter debate in regard to this idea that Obama is just not coming through, that he got people to come out at election time, and then after the election, where are the policies that deal with criminal justice reform? Where are the policies that deal with poverty and so forth? Obama's own response to that would be that I'm the president of the entire United States. I can't privilege a particular group. We can't slice and dice Americans into particular groups and target some and not benefit the others with policy. That doesn't sell to everyone. Black academia, and also in politics as well, whether it's the Congressional Black Caucus, whether it's Black Republicans who are saying something completely different about Obama, and they're stressing that this guy is a failure and he's just an old-time liberal and big spender and so forth. So out of this comes, I think, a strengthened sort of Black conservative movement that we see challenging him at every turn, whether it's a Herman Cain in 2012, whether it's a Ben Carlson running for president in 2016. So again, if you just look under the surface of Black America, you see all of these responses of Black clergy who hate the fact that Obama embraced same-sex marriage, or Black conservatives who think he's got it all wrong in regard to tax policy and everything else. And Black academicians who say, this guy is talking one way at election time and he's not following through after the election and so forth. And again, across the board, the sort of debates and the sort of cleavages and the sort of responses to Obama among African Americans, very diverse. Even if at election time, they look at the two choices and decide that whether in a sort of positive, enthusiastic way they want to sort of support Obama, or it's sort of, okay, the lesser of two evils. So, I'd rather have Obama than McCain or Romney, so we'll just go with Obama reluctantly as Black voters. So I think it would be correct to say that Black voters, the Black community over the course of his presidency was pretty solidly behind him. It would be incorrect to say that they were unanimously so, or even that the votes that are the percentage of the Black vote, and again, the percentage of the Black vote does not necessarily mean, all Black voters. A lot of people don't vote in this country. We have
your dad, right? Your dad didn't vote. This is the first time your dad voted,
he didn't
right?
vote until 2008. So it would be wrong to say that African Americans were in lockstep behind Obama just based on vote returns or proportion that voted for him. Again, there was all along the way a very rich and often fraught conversation about the meaning of his presidency.
You said that people complained that you say one thing on the campaign trail and then in office you do another thing. You don't fulfill those promises. And I started to smile a little bit because I thought, well, there you go. That's the part of this. That's the president part of this, right? That's every politician, especially when you ride in on a slogan that is something that is, as I said, really means whatever a person hearing it hears. This was something that's the second half of your book. You talk about fury in the age of Obama is the reaction part to Obama. And then you think of, this was the same thing with Make America Great Again. Some people heard that and said, well, whoa, what do you mean by that? Other people said, oh, you mean the safe streets, and we have secure borders, and we have all the positive policy things. And hope and change was the mirror of that. Like, well, hope, we all want to have hope, and you want change, but change to what? And so that struck me when you were speaking there. But since we're getting into that second part of your book there and about how this community isn't any more monolithic than fans of a baseball team, let's say, where you have some people live and die with every game, other people just wear the hat, right? So you could have varying levels of support. Plus, you may not like the other team. You may really hate the other team. Your favorite team is, right, the New York Giants and anybody who's playing the Cowboys, as they say. And so as a political observer and someone who loves to break that stuff down for people that are laymen that aren't really thinking that deeply into it, not to puff myself up, it is so great to me, fascinating thing about human nature and about people that The New York Times analysis finds that 9% of Obama voters in 2012 went for Donald Trump in 2016. And that's millions of people. And for me, I like to have my expectations subverted and shake me up. And we have an image of an Obama voter, we have an image of a Trump voter, we have an image of a Hillary voter and of, say, a Bernie Sanders voter. But people are much more fluid than maybe we would like to think they are, just as you were saying there about within the Black community. So how would you like people here who pick up the Black president and get to know him be better able to break down that complexity, to understand that within a community, people are individuals and they make their vote? And also, if you're in politics, don't write off people then say, well, hey, we're never going to go ask for their vote. But really understand we are individuals. We should be approached as individuals. And as voters, we should think like individuals. How do you hope people will get that from the Black president?
Yeah, I think that that's a major through line theme of the book, that Obama's, and this is most any president who's looking to get reelected, much of the time is creating coalition that, or a coalition that can get you elected and then reelected. So there's always the calculations and the measuring. And if I say this on this day, how does this constituency and this constituency and this constituency think about it? And do I lose more voters embracing same-sex marriage than I'll gain? Do I alienate more people when I embrace criminal justice reform than I gain? If I say this about the police behavior in this particular incident, who's going to be offended by that in this community, and so forth. So there are always those calculations that are going on among the political strategists, among politicians and others in regard to how particular segments of the electorate are going to respond to things. So the politicians and the strategists and so forth, I think, are already pretty savvy in terms of messaging and how messages play, and the idea that we are talking to a very diverse electorate, and you can't be all things to all people, although you're going to try to. The hope and change thing is more or less, as you were saying, is squishy enough and nebulous and vague enough to throw against the wall, and maybe it sticks with a lot of folks, and people can just project on it their fantasies and dreams and so forth about what hope and change mean, or what make America great means. Again, it's vague enough and squishy enough for people to load into it whatever they want to load into those particular slogans. However, at the same time, politicians have to be aware that they are talking about, they're talking to individual people who are going to vote self-interest, and however they construe self-interest. So you do have to have a message that, have to have a core message, I think. And even if it's based around a slogan, it has to be some core to it. But you also have to have ways of talking across demographic lines, across regional lines, and so forth, so that you build that coalition that gets you, the majority of the electoral college vote. So in the case of those voters that you just mentioned in 2016, shifting from Obama to Trump voters, I think was surprising in the moment, but it's not surprising in hindsight. I say that because, again, if you polled 100% of the American electorate, 99% would have said they expected Hillary Clinton to win. And I think the belief in the inevitability of her winning militated against her winning. A lot of people just sat out, including the African-American, much of the African, well, not much, but enough to have cost her the election. The African-American vote that sat out in 2016 that showed up for Obama in 2012. And again, that was across the board. I think that folks thought that, well, why I need to vote, since she has this locked up. So I think that was going on. I think also that the American electorate has a maximum attention span for a single president for about 8 years. They're really, in many instances, tired of you after 4 years, but you might be able to squeak by and get reelected. But after 8 years, our attention span, we want something new. We don't necessarily want a part three from somebody else in your party. So I think that was going on, and again, militated against Hillary Clinton being Barack Obama's third term, so to speak. And several other things were going on that suggested that voters were, as you're saying, they're voting self-interest. They're reading into these slogans things that make sense to them. They are willing to change up and swap out colors and flavors depending on, again, what they think is going to be best for them. And again, the attention span at maximum is about 6 to 8 years, and then they're tired of a particular candidate and often their party as well. And we have this, and that might be healthy for our system to have that sort of turnover. But I think that's what's going on in 2016 that speaks to a very complicated electorate. And that swings, we often have big swings in terms of what our partisan identifications are, or who we elect to represent us in the Congress and the presidency and so forth. Part of that has to do with the nature of our system. A two-party system is either or. There's no middle ground. We have all these third parties and things, but seriously, we just have two parties. So if you get tired of the Democrats, the only other option is the Republicans. So often a hard swing rightward. Get tired of these guys after a while, and you will, then it's back to the left and so forth. So because we have a two-party system and people have to choose between left and right in these two different parties, I don't know, it looks more surprising that a person could vote for Obama in 2012 and then vote for Trump in 2016 as opposed to Hillary Clinton. But again, given the nature of the system, I imagine if many of those people could vote for some middle candidate between left and right, we'd have much more of that as opposed to people voting for the two extremes.
People also wanted to be on board and vote historic. And I recall with my own father, who was a registered Democrat, never changed from back almost in the New Deal days. He's not quite that old, and he's still with us at 86. But I remember during the New Jersey primary, by then it was sewn up in 88 for Dukakis, who obviously was Greek. So everyone, again, expects monolithic. Every single person I had to meet had to ask me how excited I was about Mike Dukakis. I said, Mike Dukakis isn't excited about Mike Dukakis. Why should I? Just because I'm Greek? But he would just. But my dad said, I'm going to go to the primary. I'm going to vote for Jesse Jackson, even though it's wrapped up, because I feel like let them be forced to say no to him. He can't have the nomination. And this is, in fact, what they try to do with the superdelegates. Hillary does in 2008 with Barack Obama. And hey, it's not your turn yet. And this is something that we often hear in politics, but I think especially to tell an African American it's not time yet is something that is, we've kind of been waiting a long time. I think it's well past time. You can understand that feeling, and ultimately he does win the nomination. Even to his surprise, I believe, you've spoken about this in The Black President, that he ran and maybe you could aspire to a cabinet position, and usually it would be the political move just to shove you off to HUD, right? Housing and urban development. You must know about that and want to do that. And people, I'm sure, would have been fine at that with the community organizing experience in Chicago. And then he starts to gain momentum and he surprises even himself. And that's pretty fascinating. People become compelled by his story. So that's certainly something you cover here in The Black President. There's a wave, and even he is riding that wave and caught up in it and pushed forward. And he says later, maybe it was too soon for me that I came along. That's all fascinating stuff in the book. And I imagine for you, uncovering documentation about that while writing The Black President must have been a lot of fun for you and kept you going, pushed the wave of the book forward so you finished it.
Yeah, and that was one of the things, Dean, in regard to writing in the moment or writing shortly after the moment, is that you're watching this thing, I guess, sort of riding the wave of it as an observer, and as an historian who's trying to get, some sort of perspective and distance from what you're watching up close and personal. So it's a sort of double vision that's going on. That is, I'm collecting all the things I can get my hands on. So it's, this memoir and government documents and YouTube videos of speeches, and it's interviews with folks and so forth. So you're collecting all these things, but at the same time, you're anticipating the next thing. Okay, how's this Tea Party thing going to shake out? Okay, how's this, Wall Street protest going to shake out? Okay, this Black Lives Matter thing that just cropped up in response to police violence. So you're you're sort of anticipating, okay, what's next? What's next? What's next? And what are the documents? Who do I need to talk to? What are the sources going to come out of here? Let me see all the videos that get uploaded on YouTube about this, that, and the other. So that was both exciting, and again, it's an odd place for a historian to be. The sort of we usually are not watching to see what's next. We already know what's next because it's a story that's happened before in the past, and we're again using the hindsight of the present to read the past as historians. We're not sort of watching something historic happen and trying to figure out why is it historic and how we're going to document this going forward. So it was very exciting in that way, the sort of insider, outsider, historian, observer, person that's trying to document something that's unfolding before your eyes and think about it and conceptualize it in historical ways without the benefit of hindsight, and trying to identify, okay, in 50 years from now, are people going to be talking about the Affordable Care Act as this big achievement? Or are they going to be looking at all of these presidents in the early 21st century as having failed on climate change, where we, in 50 years from now, have a climate catastrophe? Is that the big through line for the Obama presidency? Or is the through line what's going on in the Republican Party and what the Republican Party has become in 21st century, or the first couple of decades in 21st century? So you're looking for through lines. Okay, what are the major legacies, themes, thoroughfares of this particular presidency, and how to talk about it. But yeah, I was, the book was an exciting project insofar as I hadn't seen the movie yet. It wasn't a case in which you're writing about Lincoln, and the 1,000 Lincoln biographies out there. So you know that the movie is. Maybe you didn't see this particular 2-second thing and you didn't notice, and somebody still writes a book on that 2 seconds about Lincoln's presidency. But in this case, you didn't. I was looking at the movie and then writing the book about the movie as it was happening, and then trying to write the book about the movie in ways that would be helpful to think about the movie as a complete thing, this Obama presidency. So that was again the challenge, but also I think that was maybe the payoff, that is having someone with a historian's perspective observing things with that particular hat on. And then immediately after a few years, after digesting his presidency for a few years, then to write what will, hopefully be known as the first serious presidency, or a book about the Obama presidency in its entirety.
You're enjoying my conversation with Professor Claude A. Clegg III. He's the author of that book that he was just speaking about, that first draft of history. It's called The Black President: Hope and Fury in the Age of Obama. Visit him at claudeclegg.com and at Claude Clegg on Twitter. That last name is spelled Clegg. Eric Garcetti, the mayor of Los Angeles, says of The Black President, "This volume is more than a history of the Obama presidency. It is a summary of the era's most searing lessons on race and identity, a prism through which to understand our nation's fractured present, and a roadmap for building a more just society." Professor Clegg, I like the idea that we look back and we all want unity, right? We want unity on our terms. It's a little bit like a marriage in politics, right? We want to get along. If only they would listen to me. And then, or a friendship, right? Come on, why can't we both agree that we do what I want? And it's fascinating that Mayor Garcetti talks about that there and says, sees the fractures today, and as a politician realizes deep down, a good politician, I think, a good servant of the people, that at the very least, that's what people want, because we're a little bit, even though they work for us, we're a little bit all like the audience, or we're like children, or we're like family members, let's say, because we elect them. They're not exactly like parents, but it's a feeling that you get where you say, gee, I don't want to see you fighting. I know that there's a hard core on both sides that wants to just see you call the other side jerks and call them names and just beat them. And there's a place for that, like in football. I mentioned the sports analogy. Certainly, we like to see in hockey a fight sometimes, as a hockey fan myself. But you also want to see sportsmanship. You don't hit a guy when he's down. You do certain things in politics. Lead us. You're supposed to be leaders. We call you leaders. For family, for Barack Obama, that idea of unity comes from his parents. And I think often of his quote about his mother. He said when he would hang out with real hardcore black militants and they would start talking about the white person as the devil, he said, I would think of my mother's smile and I would realize I can't buy into that 100%. It would pull him back. And speaking of governing, I wanted to get in a question that Bijan C. Bayne was kind enough to offer up to us. He said, yeah, I'll definitely do this. I've long admired Professor Clegg's work. I interviewed him twice. His books are Elgin Baylor, The Man Who Changed Basketball, and Martha's Vineyard Basketball, How a Resort League Defied Notions of Race and Class. And by the way, you could see his Elgin Baylor biography right up there next to your book. I put it in good company with the Black President. He also is the writer-producer of 6 Degrees of Kareem Abdul-Jabbar. He speculated how Obama might have navigated what is the COVID-19 pandemic, something that does have racial components in it. People are concerned. There's a lot in the African-American community that don't want to get vaccinated with good reason historically. So how do you think he would have handled COVID-19 in a way that would have informed his opponents and harshest critics' sense of him? And he already dealt with Ebola, so maybe you can make some informed, or certainly you can, speculation on that. How would a President Obama have dealt with this global pandemic?
Yeah, that's a great question. A great, counterfactual, since it didn't actually happen, but I think it's a good way to sort of think about Obama and his character and his political methodology. He's a technocrat. That is, he's one of those folks who would be following the science. He believes in expertise and surrounding yourself with people who have the resumes that you were mentioning, Dean. People who have experience and education and so forth. And so he's a technocrat, and insofar as if you get enough information, enough expertise together, you can solve a lot of the problems that the country is facing. So he would have been relying upon the scientists and the epidemiological views of what was going on and those who study pandemics and so forth. I think that, however, we wouldn't have seen lockdowns under him any more, absolute than we've seen under Presidents Trump or Biden. We would not have seen, I think it would have been a bumpy ride, just as we've had with these current 2 presidents, Trump and Biden, in regard to the pandemic. I think that there would have been limits to what he could do for any given population. You rightly said that African Americans have suffered in ways that have been unique to them, and in ways that not unique to them. As frontline workers, people overrepresented in service industries and so forth, people in crowded urban spaces, people overrepresented in being uninsured. So African Americans have experienced the pandemic in ways that are worse than, in many cases, than other populations. Life expectancy of African Americans has gone down further during the pandemic than it has with Hispanics or whites, Asians, and so forth. So he would have been facing that more dire crisis among African Americans. And the question would be, do you target this group? Do you target resources? Do you target healthcare to this particular group, public health messaging to this particular group who's suffering worse? Or is it just sort of universalist, tide that lifts all boats? We're not targeting anyone in particular, we're targeting everyone. My sense is that he would have been himself. That is, he would have been the universalist. We're going to help everyone. I can't just target this particular group. If he was true to form, he would not have overtly targeted the people who are faring worse in this. However, because again, it looks like favoritism, it looks like he's privileging his quote unquote own group and so forth, and he did not want that look, because that could be easily weaponized by his opponents to say, hey, look, this guy is actually discriminating against white voters, and he's helping the black voters and so forth. We should be helping everyone. He was self-conscious about coming off in that way. And I don't think he would have if he had been steering our response to the coronavirus. Ironically, his vice president, now President Biden, has used that very language. That is, I could not imagine a Barack Obama saying that, the Black community has always had my back and I'm going to have their back, which Biden has said. I can't imagine Barack Obama saying, I'm going to elect or select a Black woman for the Supreme Court. He may have done that, although he never did. But he may have done it, but in the sort of, this is a lock. There's going to be a Black woman in this slot. So Obama, I don't think had the sort of leeway to name race in the ways that Biden has leeway to do, or at least has taken the latitude to do. And I think that his response to the pandemic would have shown that he just couldn't target certain groups. He may have, in a sort of surreptitious way, tried to help the least advantaged by doing it in a sort of class-oriented way, helping those in poverty. It's kind of like the Affordable Care Act does, which, because African Americans are disproportionately represented among the poor in this population in this country, helping the poor helps them disproportionately. So in a sort of underground or sort of indirect way, you're helping African Americans and Hispanics and others who are overrepresented among those who are less privileged and low wealth people in this country. But in regard to an approach that would have targeted certain groups that were faring worse in this pandemic, whether it's job loss or whether it's access to healthcare or whatever, I don't see him as having done that. So I think his response would have looked a lot like Joe Biden's response. He would have been all for the vaccinations, as he is. People getting vaccinated and making those vaccinations available free of charge widely. He would have been all for limited mask mandates, although I can't see him being able to push the states any harder than, let's say, Biden or Trump did. I just think that's ingrained in the DNA of this country. This notion of I should have the liberty to do certain things, the government shouldn't intervene, and we have a lot of state governments that actually believe that way too, and governors and state legislatures. So I don't know if his response would look appreciably different from Biden's response in particular. This reliance upon the experts and expertise and pushing the vaccines and pushing employers to require vaccinations and so forth, without the sort of zero COVID policy of, let's say, China, which just locks down the country. We wouldn't have had lockdowns or anything under Obama, and thus I wouldn't think it. Again, his response will look really different from the response of Biden. And I'm not sure if African Americans would have been any more willing to go get vaccinated, maybe on the margins, with a Black president saying go get vaccinated, as opposed to Biden and a Black vice president saying the same thing.
I want to quote from the New York Times review where Orlando Patterson says that the election shattered centuries of ingrained pessimism. For me, when I was on the bus going across the George Washington Bridge from Englewood, New Jersey on the day of the election, this is a town that has a big Black population. It was in the Green Book. I would point that out to people at the bar there. Reverend Al Sharpton lives there. You would think that bus would have been a party bus going into the city the day after Barack Obama was elected. And instead, it was people saying that, well, they're going to kill him. He's going to be assassinated. It's just a matter of when. I felt sad for the people that said that because they were missing out on some joy there. And all they could think of was that pessimism. So I wanted to ask you how your book, The Black President, gives some much needed optimism, but also motivates people that are there that think, well, I have no chance, because this book is about a two-term president. It is not about a president that lost his life in office or was otherwise driven out. So how do you hope that people get that optimism and maybe a little bit of that sense of unity about their country from the Black president?
Yeah, I think that just the fact that a Barack Obama is possible, as far as becoming not only, as you mentioned, Dean, a president, but two-term president, and pretty popular going out of office in 2017, says something tremendous about the country. about the possibilities of America that a lot of people didn't think. Again, I start the book with a conversation with my dad. He was one of those skeptics, and that, they're not going to elect the black guy. And if they do, elect the black guy, he's going to be in danger all the time and so forth. But he catches the spark of, I want to participate in this history making. I'm going to register to vote here in my 70s. I'm going to register to vote late 70s. Never voted before, but I'm going to bother to do that. I'm going to bother to go and vote for this guy twice, aside from his generation, which probably was more pessimistic about race relations because they had grown up in Jim Crow and segregation, seen the civil rights movement and so forth. And then think about the younger generation, my son, whose political consciousness, he's born in 2001. When he first knew that there was a White House and that this country, its chief executive was a president and they lived in the White House, it was Barack Obama. His first sense of who led the country, it was this black guy. And not just my son, but tens of millions of other young people who came of age politically. And it was a black first family in the White House for 8 years. I don't know if we quite know yet as a country what that means for those young people. That was normal to them. For us who have a longer view, it was really unusual, unique to have a first family that was not a white first family. But for that generation of early 21st century folks who came of age in the first decade or so of the 21st century, a black first family was normal to them. And now a black vice president who's female is sort of normal to the folks who are coming of age now. And again, we'll have to get some distance from that and do a lot of polling and that sort of thing to see what that really means to these young people and their political development, their social development, their social maturity, how they think about race, how they think about the possibilities of America. But I think it's huge that we have a whole generation of young folks in particular who grew up at a time in which there's this normality that includes a first family in the White House for almost a decade. So I think that there's, on that side, if that's the glass half full, then those are the sorts of things that I think say very powerful things, messages about what the country is and is capable of. Of course, there's the glass half empty too. That is the argument, and I understand the argument, and I'm sympathetic to it to a point, that you couldn't have Donald Trump without first having Barack Obama. Trump makes no sense, except he's the anti-Obama. He's the guy who's going to go in and turn back the clock. He's the guy who's going to go in and rail against this diversity, and we need to make America great again. Some thought that meant taking us back to the 50s. We need a border wall to keep all these Mexicans out. We need, and we need a Muslim ban to keep all these foreign Muslim people out. We need to make sure these blacks aren't voting 50 times during the elections and when the elections roll around. So we need all this voter suppression policy and so forth. So that's the other side of the sword, the double-edged sword, that is, America is a country that allows someone like Barack Obama, who's more or less raised by a single parent in the middle of the ocean and it's not raised in privilege at all. His dad abandons him pretty early in life. He does sort of go through the ranks of being groomed as a political elite. He goes to Ivy League schools. He's in Columbia, and then he's at Harvard, and then he's an Illinois state senator, and he's a U.S. senator. So he's not just any black guy who becomes president. He is a certain kind of elite, a black elite who goes through a certain number of gates that he's allowed to pass through until he gets the credentials that look like a lot of other presidents. So I think that there's reason for optimism, and Obama's an optimistic person. I think most presidents are optimistic people. They have to be the country's #1 cheerleader. So he's optimistic about the country, the whole hope and change, and yes, we can, and so forth. I think that's who he is, but at the same time, I think that he understands that the White House, the chief executive, needs to project the positive about the country, and he needs to appeal for the kind of unity that you were mentioning, Dean. But at the same time, I think that there's a very powerful backlash against this the whole idea of Barack Obama and a black guy in the White House, and then two, the kind of multicultural democracy, multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy that we are evolving into, and the fear of a good number of our countrymen and countrywomen that they're being left behind, their voices are not being heard, they may be losing, power or access to power and privilege that they can become accustomed to enjoying, and that Obama's election to the White House is emblematic of that loss of power and privilege and status and so forth. So I think there are good reasons to be optimistic, but at the same time, there are good reasons to be very clear-eyed about the state of American democracy and the sort of backlash that we saw against Obama in the person of Donald Trump, and also in the texture of what our country is now, the sort of threats that we see and peril that we see American democracy going through.
Fascinating that both Obama and Trump also benefited, I would say, as real outsiders. Obama's obviously the ultimate outsider, no one who looked like him before. Then Trump is our only president, never served anywhere in government, never was a man in the military. And they both run against Hillary Clinton, who, to my way of thinking, after reading all these biographies behind me, I kind of like the person with the resume. I think that should be part of the job, right? I'm like one of those political wonks I just mentioned that say, hey, it's not your turn, people. You can't come in here, Donald Trump. Why don't you run for alderman at least or something? And you can't be. It's not your time to be president. And you put in that work and you build a resume, and then everybody goes and attacks it. So this was the case for both of them, and I think that's fascinating, because if it hadn't been Hillary Clinton in those elections, who knows what might have happened. So this is a fascinating thing too in the black president, where you're thrown in there and you are in the administration, you're with him, you're in his campaign, Barack Obama, and you're saying, whoa, now it's up to us to govern. That's fascinating. I want to close with a photo of Barack Obama, the young Barack Obama, and ask you to use it as a way to explain to people what they're getting here in your book, the man that they get to know. It's the photo of him, the young future president, with his father. And it's one of the only ones I've ever seen of him with his father, and not at a baseball game, not at home on the couch. It's just at an airport. And he's just beaming, this young man, Barack Obama. He's clutching his father's hand that's slung over his shoulder, beaming at the camera. And you can see the longing in his face. It's really a heartbreaking picture to me every time I see it. In part because his dad is kind of looking off to the side and has just the smile you'd put on for any photo. This is not the moment make or break in his life that he's seeing his son. Barack Obama has only one father, of course, but his father has other children, other families, other wives, and so it's not this moment. And you could just see it in this young kid's face. He clearly longed for his father. That approval is something he certainly carries into his presidency, that search for approval, rather. What does that photograph tell you about the man that you hope people pick up the black president and meet in your book and see how he is a man unlike any other, in one sense, a president unlike any other, but he is somebody who's just a human being. He had a past. He had a mother and father. He had trouble. He wasn't going to be perfect. But what do you hope that picture, that little kid, what do you see in it? And how will people, when they pick up the black president, get to meet that kid and see how he did what no one else had ever done before him?
Oh, wow. That's an excellent question, especially the last, a concluding question. Wow, it's a big one, Dean. It's a great question. That picture, it struck me in a similar way that, we know the story. That's the last time he saw his father in life. He didn't know that at the time, but we know that looking at that picture, Obama himself will later say that, not having a relationship with his father was an opportunity lost when he heard of his father's death in a car accident in the early 80s, when he would have been in his 20s, Obama Jr., the son. It's a picture that, it's one of those pictures that states 1,000 words, maybe a couple of thousand words. It says something about his father's investment in the son, which was not as much as I think the son would have liked for it to be. And I certainly, as a father myself, think that there should have been much more investment from the father into the son's life. Again, he was about 10, Obama, it was the early 1970s. His dad had come back to Hawaii to visit him, and it was a couple of weeks, and he was gone again, and he never saw his father again. And that sticks with Obama in a number of ways. One, it makes him willing to sort of call out absentee fathers once he becomes a national candidate for the presidency, and throughout his presidency, he's calling out men who are not stepping up to the plate, and in particular Black men who are not stepping up to the plate, and for whatever reasons, and being in their kids' lives as thoroughly and as consistently as they should be. There was those critics that said that he's just using this politically to appeal to white conservative voters by saying that I'm willing to go after people in my own group and my own constituency, and thus you can't say that I'm a hyper partisan guy, since I'm willing to go after African American men. So there are those who are saying this is a very crude political calculation that he's using to appeal to white moderates. Maybe, perhaps so. Obama, his retort would be, as someone who lived it, look at that picture. The last time I saw my dad, I was 10 years old. And before that, I had no living consciousness of dad except for that moment when I was 10 years old. I lived this. I experienced it. It's an epidemic. Absentee fathers in this country, especially in some communities. I have every right to speak about it. And everyone else should be speaking about this epidemic and finding out why our fathers don't have the supports or don't have the mentality or whatever it is to stand up and stay in their families, whether we need to, do something in regard to job training or the educational system or the criminal justice system. This is a real problem. And as someone who lived it, who went through it, I have every right to speak about it. And that's a rub for him throughout his public life within the Black community. That is, there are those who say he's bringing out dirty laundry simply to appeal to white moderates. And then there are those who are saying, we need, someone, you need the teacher to say it. We need the clergy person to say it. We need the neighbors to say it. We need the president to point out that this is a problem. Broken families, single parent households, that's a problem. And we need as a society to address it. African Americans across the board, whatever the group is concerned. So, you could argue that the father's memory or his father as a sort of abstraction serves political goals in some ways. That is, it allows him to talk about fatherhood and talk about responsibility and so forth in ways that may be appealing to this constituency or not so much to that constituency. And there's probably some political calculation behind using that sort of rhetoric in particular moments. I think he embraces his father more prior to running for office, and then when he runs for office, the highest office, the presidency, there's he wants to get distance. This guy was a bad father. He was bad to his kids. He's bad to his wives. He drank too much and so forth. So he certainly seeks to get distance. His father is sort of a foil for how not to be a father, and Obama himself is the self-conscious or trying to be a self-conscious example of how to be a father, and how he and Michelle performed this sort of nuclear idealized family life for 8 years in front of us in the White House with their two girls. So I think the father in that way has his sort of usages politically for Obama, but at the same time, I just on a human level, as you were saying, Dean, every kid deserves to have both parents, in their family. And Obama was robbed of that in regard to having his biological father in his family. And I'm, as an individual, I'm willing to give him a certain sort of latitude to speak to that, even if there are those who think that he's doing it in sort of crude political calculating ways. I think that having, him having gone through that experience of and not having the father in the house gives him a certain sort of space to speak to that issue, regardless of who might be offended by being taken to task.
Well, Professor Clegg, I hope people will pick up the Black president, get to follow that child on his journey and see how It inspires all of us, whatever we have stacked against us or think we do. Every president, that's what I've learned from reading these biographies, and certainly yours was no exception. There's all kinds of times you could just give up and give in to pessimism and say, I can't do it. And he doesn't do that. So thank you very much for giving us this view. I wish you the best of luck with this book, and I hope everyone picks up a copy, get to know him, not just as a transformative leader, not just as somebody you voted for or against, but see this first draft of our recent history and figure out how we got here and how we go forward and try to build that more perfect union tomorrow. Thanks again so much for joining me.
Dean, it's been a pleasure.
Again, the book is The Black President, Hope and Fury in the Age of Obama. As always, you can find the Amazon link to purchase your copy at thehistoryauthor.com page for this episode. By buying a book through us, you help keep the flux capacitor on our time machine humming like usual. But wherever you buy the book, please do pick up a copy of this. I can't thank Professor Claude A. Clegg III enough for joining us and for giving us these precious views and this precious early draft of the 44th president's historic 2 terms. Visit our guest at claudeclegg.com and at Claude Clegg on Twitter. Again, that name is CLEGG. As for my social media platform, you can find it all linked at historyauthor.com. See that? I won't make you spell my last name because it's a lot harder than Clegg. And if you enjoyed watching this conversation, please do subscribe at our YouTube and Rumble channels for future journeys in the Wayback Machine. Plus, you can catch my Washington Times columns. I hope you'll find them just as thoughtful as this conversation today. Speaking with somebody like Professor Clegg, I have to tell you, it's a real treat for me. It's so great to be able to dig into current events with our eye on history and what we know from the past and what today tells the people of tomorrow about who we were as Americans. That's it for this installment of the History Author Show. I hope you'll join us for the next all-new interview right here on iHeartRadio or wherever you enjoyed this journey into yesterday. Until that next trip into the past together, on behalf of Professor Clegg and myself, thanks so much for time traveling with us today, and have a great week.
We still call it Broadway, but what's in a name? Take it from Georgie, it isn't the same. On the east side, west side, things ain't like before. There are tears in the